Okay, so welcome everybody, also from my side, and welcome Erin Manning and Brian Massumi, who also, because of some lucky coincidences, found their way to our little, but as all of you hopefully will see during the next days, nice little Gießen. So, I wanted to take the basic information a bit shorter in order to then introduce to their talk. Erin Manning holds a university research chair in relational art and philosophy in the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia University. And Brian Massumi is professor in the Department of Communication Sciences at the University of Montréal, Quebec, Canada. So, first of all, I want to say that we here in Gießen, at the Institute for Applied Theatre Studies, are really not among the first ones who encountered the refreshing quality of your, I would say, very unique thought for our inquiries. It was, for example, in the frame of a workshop Bojana Cvejic and Jan Ritzema had organized in the context of Steirischer Herbst Festival several years ago already now, when your names started, and I'm paraphrasing now, an essay by Bojana Cvejic tingle the lips of many today, not only in the fields of performance arts and visual arts, but let's say when your thought somehow more and more also from this direction started to influence our practices and theories. In order to introduce both of you, I would like to start with a little anecdote. And it goes like this. Brian Massumi is the one who translated Mille Plateaus by Félix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze into 1,000 Plateaus. And I would suggest that already the fact that the title of the English translation is 1,000 Plateaus and not just 1,000 Plateaus or the 1,000 Plateaus even, might already hopefully, this is also a bit flattering now, hopefully not too much, point to a certain uniqueness also of your thought, because this indefinite A before 1,000 Plateaus, for me, has a lot to do with what you're doing with the philosophical influences you're dealing with in your own writing. Because in contrast to rather narrowing methods, which would just apply one side, may it be theory or practice, to the other, and therefore flattening the side something is applied to, you're always somehow moving through the very middle of things, dealing with some kind of experimental, processual and continuous construction of methodology, and therefore to refer to this kind of image, always open every stratified island in order to connect it to open oceans of thought again. I think you can find the titles of the various publications by Brian Massumi and Erin Manning in the abstract, so I don't want to go through that now, and just say I'm looking very forward. Thank you very, very much that you are here this night. And the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? It's loud enough. Thank you for inviting us. This is a real pleasure. We're in Frankfurt working with the Forsyth company for a month, and it's very nice to be able to jump from Frankfurt to here for a couple days and see old friends and finally put faces on people whose books we've read, who never look like they should look, but we then get used to the idea. I just want to say that although Brian and I have written probably quite extensively on both movement and politics, this piece is not strictly about movement or politics, though I hope you will see that it does engage with both in all kinds of different micro-political or micro-perceptual ways. And the other thing I want to say is that this work comes out of a collaboration of mine with a group of autists in the US who are part of a movement for neurodiversity. And because a lot of people have just don't know very much about autism or may have prejudices about autism, I'd just like to say that while the autists that I'm working with don't speak, they have extraordinary capacities in writing. And so the quotations that we're using come from their writing, and they hopefully will be here speaking in their own names, not just in ours.
So maybe I should have another mic, because my voice doesn't carry very well.
Yeah.
So as Erin mentioned, we're going to be working from self-descriptions of autistic perception, and we're going to be talking about two modes of perception which we don't see as mutually exclusive, but on a kind of continuum, but with certain polar extremes, with autism at the one end. And the suggestion is that all along that continuum, there are singular modalities of perception that correspond to forms of life or modes of existence, and that there is another political dimension, perhaps, in the respect of that diversity, which we're calling, following the autist movement, neurodiversity. And although this piece doesn't talk directly about dance, a lot of the concepts that we're mobilizing here come originally out of Erin's work on dance, and you'll notice a term called the dance of attention that is also coming from that work. The title is Coming Alive in a World of Texture for Neurodiversity.
The notion of existence involves the notion of an environment of existences and of types of existences.
Any one instance of existence involves other existences, connected with it and yet beyond it.
This notion of the environment introduces the notion of the more and less.
And of multiplicity.
Alfred North Whitehead. More and less, multiplicity.
Quote, "There's very little difference in meaning," says autist Diana Crumans, "between the children next to the lake that I was playing with and the turtle sitting on the log. It seems," she continues, "that when most people think of something being alive, they really mean human."
What is it we really mean when we say human? According to autism activist Amanda Baggs, we certainly don't mean autistic. We mean neurotypical. We mean expressing oneself predominantly in spoken language. And most of all, we mean immediately focused on humans to the detriment of other elements in the environment. Quote, "Most people attend to human voices above all else," Crumans.
"I hear the rocks and the trees," MM.
For autism researcher Simon Baron-Cohen, to hear the rocks and the trees on an equal footing with the voices of children is a sign of what he calls, quote, mind-blindness. He defines mind-blindness as, quote, an inability to develop an awareness of what is in the mind of another human, end quote. To have mind-blindness, he says, is to lack empathy. It is to be generally unrelational. He says that this is what defines autists.
Yet from the autistic, we hear neither a rejection of the human nor a turning away from relation. What we hear is an engagement with the more than human. Quote, I attend to everything the same way with no discrimination, so that the caw of the crow in the tree is as clear and important as the voice of the person I'm walking with, Crewmans. And an engagement with the more textured relating. My world is organized around textures, all emotions, perceptions, my whole world has been influenced by textures, Crewmans.
To experience the texture of the world, quote, without discrimination, is not indifference. Texture is patterned, full of contrast and movement, gradients and transitions. It is complex and differentiated. To attend to everything, quote, the same way, is not an inattention to life. It is to pay equal attention to the full range of life's texturing complexity, with an entranced and unhierarchized commitment to the way in which the organic and the inorganic, color, sound, smell, and rhythm, perception, and emotion intensely interweave into the, quote, aroundness of a textured world, alive with difference.
It is to experience the fullness of a dance of attention. For all the challenges of autism, this is not without joy. Quote, everything is somewhat alive to me, Crewmans.
Quote, happiness to me was the immediateness of the environment, Mukhopadhyay.
A dance of attention is the holding pattern of an immersive, almost unidentifiable set of forces that modulate the event in the immediateness of its coming to expression. Attention not to, but with and toward, in and around, undecomposably. Quote, all the time, shadows had to borrow the colors of the objects on which they would fall, writes artist and poet Tito Mukhopadhyay. And they colored all objects in one universal color. That color is the color of a shadow, which is a darker color on the borrowed color, end quote. A colored shadowing, an intertwining of fields of emergent experience. Not yet defined is this or that. Not defined is this or that, yet their qualities already interact. The fields in their immediacy play off each other, lending their qualities to each other, composing a single field of mutual action, of co-fusion and changing contrast, co-motion, an immediate commotion of qualitative texturing, a generative holding pattern already moving qualitatively toward an experience in the making. Colored shadow has emerged, a quality belonging to the compositional field, not to its elements, but to the immediacy of their mutual relation.
The emergence continues, quote, I could now imagine how a shadow could silence the interaction between other colors, if those colors happened to fall in the territory of its silence, end quote. A hiatus forms in the commotion, made of the same interacting qualities as the commotion, quote. I could see the night jasmines wet with morning dew, lit with fresh sunshine, trying to form a story with their jasmine petal smell. I would see the story spread in the air, end quote. A new quality of fragrance arrives in the hiatus. A flowering dances to attention as the event of this ingression. Jasmine gathers the play of color and shadow around itself, transmuted into an interplay of moisture and light. Light and moisture in co-motion with a smell. The fragrance of jasmine in its interplay with moisture and light takes the relay from a colored shadow as the predominant quality of the compositional field as a whole. This relay brings the field to the verge of determinate expression. In the field's perfusion by smell, a story is trying to form. The field is moving through its perfusion toward a recounting of itself. It is striving to be taken into account. The flower has appeared as a function of this striving. It is not a discrete object. The field of immediate experience is not composed of objects. The flower is the relational conduit for a field-wide tendency to expression. It might be called an objectile rather than a fully bloomed object, a bud of an object. The field composes buds of object as a function of its appetition for expression.
The dance of attention evoked here by Mukhopadhyay is the attentiveness in the environment of a pre-articulate expressibility tending toward a determinate expression yet to come. Caught in the middling of this event, Mukhopadhyay is not the maker of the scene. He attends to its dance, co-composing with it. Quote, "I would see that the moment I put my shadow above the flowers, the story would immediately stop forming," end quote. The moment he overshadows the field, imposing his presence on it, its activity stops. Mukhopadhyay must remain co-present, flower, shadow, story, field dance to attention, in an indetermination of a coming to be determined, at the very boundary between experiencing and imagining in the moment, yet untold. Quote, "My boundary between imagining and experiencing something was a very delicate one. Perhaps it still is. So many times I need to cross-check with mother or someone who can understand my voice now, whether an incident really happened around my body or presence," end quote. Presence with, in, and around a budding field becoming, impatient attentiveness toward what the field wants, uncertainty in the aroundness. Where does the body begin and end? Where is the relay between imagination and experience? The coming to further expression of the field in conversation for cross-checking moves the center of gravity of the experience into another field, that of language. But this is poetic language, not strictly fact-seeking, a language for story, a language that holds on to the tensile oscillation of imagining and experiencing, that composes with the threshold of expressibility that was already active in the field, tuning to expression where there is not yet either a fully bloomed object nor a fully flowered subject, only the intensely experiencing, imagining bud of a qualitative becoming toward making sense in language.
The dance of attention is attentiveness not of the human to the environment, but attentiveness of the environment to its own flowering, at the very limit where experience and imagination, immediacy and cross-checking overlap. The making felt of a co-compositional force that does not yet seek to distinguish between human and non-human, subject and object, emphasizing instead an immediacy of mutual action, an associated milieu of their emergent relation. This co-compositional engagement with the associated milieu of emergent relation is an environmental mode of awareness. It is a mode of existence integral for autists to all aspects of experience. They do not bemoan this modality of awareness as a deficit, but affirm as a mode of existence intertwined tendentially with other modes of existence, such as those more, quote, human by the neurotypical definition that are centered on language.
Autism activist Jim Sinclair writes, "Autism isn't something a person has or a shell that a person is trapped inside. There's no normal child hidden behind the autism. Autism is a way of being. It is pervasive. It colors every experience, every sensation, perception, thought, emotion, and encounter, every aspect of experience. It is not possible to separate the autism from the person, and if it were possible, the person you'd have left would not be the same person you started with," end quote. Persons come in many modes, and persons become.
Autistic perception dances attention, affirming the interconnectedness of modes of existence, foregrounding the relationality at the heart of perception, emphasizing how experience unfolds through the matrix of qualitative fields of overlap and emphasis, already immediately moving toward expression in a dynamic field of becoming alive with co-composition. For autists, language comes late, and it is this that perhaps marks most starkly their difference from neurotypicals. What we mean by that is they often only learn to use language in the writing at adolescence. Neurotypical experience tends immediately to align to the beyond of the associated milieu of relation, to an ulterior phase in which the flower stands alone, a solitary object separate from its shadow stories. The separating out of the object backgrounds the intrinsic relationality of the fields coming to expression, clearing the stage for an overshadowing human subject to cast his presence in its place, in order to take personal credit for the field's environmentally emergent accounting for itself.
Fielding and affordance.
This notion of the environment, says Whitehead, introduces the notion of the more and less, and of multiplicity. The idea is not simply to turn the tables and say that neurotypicals suffer from environment blindness owing to their focus on the human, and on the human-centric use value that the objectiles active in the environment may be cast for. Neurotypicals also have environmental awareness, more and less, more peripheralized, less often attended to in its own right. Conversely, even most so-called low-functioning autists are not without language, as the quotes in the previous section show, even though many are without spoken language. Quote, "Not being able to speak is not the same as not having anything to say," reads one of the slogans of the Autistic Liberation Front. Despite their initial focus on the qualitative relationality of emergent environments, autists are also capable, more and less, depending on many factors, of perceiving, quote, "objectively." By objectively, we mean in a mode in which focalized impacts and their eventual uses and recountings in language single themselves out as particular affordances from the fielding of the environment. We call this the mode of entrainment.
Entrainment in relation to Mukapadaa's flower field would have immediately placed the flowering within an efficient mode, such as picking or smelling. That Mukapadaa's experience is less of the flower itself than of the field of flowering and shadowing and storying does not suggest that he cannot also smell the flower or eventually differentiate it from other affordances. What it suggests is that there is a tendency within autism to immediately perceive the relational quality of a welling environment that dynamically appears in a jointness of experience. This foregrounding of the immediate field of experience we call entertainment. Entertainment is prior to the distinction between active and passive, subject and object. Entertainment is to be captivated in a dance of attention. All experiential fielding includes incipient entrainments and immediate entertainments. It is a question of degree and of mixture. The call to smell a flower upon seeing it, the welling sense that a flower is for something, for smelling, is a neurotypical response that is already moving toward grasping the flower as an object against the environment as a background, even as the environment is just coming to entertainment. For the neurotypical, the mode of entertainment tends already to be saturated with entrainment. The field of experience is pre-perfused with forness. It is already tending toward expression and use value, rather than entertaining expressibility on its own account. For the autist, the flower and environment, entrainment, and entertainment are not immediately separable. Flower and environment are not reciprocally delimited as foreground and background, separable object and surround, but feature jointly in coactivity. They co-feature as tonal differences in a field modulating the whole of experience at all levels, composing an overall mode of existence that is in a different key than the neurotypical norm. Quote, "Modes of existence are always plural and relational," writes Etienne Souriau. "Existence can be found not only in beings, but between them," end quote. Modes of existence are intermodal. As defined by Souriau and Simondon, modes of existence do not reify being by taking it as already constituted. They involve comings to existence through singular events where objects are in the making. The modality of the event's singular coming to be is the existence. There is not an already constituted being that has the modality makes the being. Modes of existence are not only intermodal, they are also plural in relation to themselves, each containing the others in germ to a degree as an internal difference that is a compositional feature of its own texturing. Each tends to want of the others. Modes of existence have inbred appetite for each other and cannot easily sustain themselves separately, try as they might sometimes.
The autism rights movement emphasizes the multiplicity of modes of existence under the term neurodiversity. They are not only signaling the need to attend to the blooming of fields of relation from which neither predefined objects nor overshadowing subjects have yet to be singled out. They are alerting us as well to the intricacies of perception across the spectrum. For neurotypicals are in fact neurodiverse, also immediately perceiving relation. The difference is the speed of subtraction of objects from the total field, owing to the field's pre-perfusion with entrainment. Under certain circumstances, neurotypicals themselves experience a predominance of environmental awareness. It is rarely focused on, though, appearing as an ephemeral interlude between more substantial feeling affordances. When environmental awareness does resurface, it is without fully bloomed objects and overshadowing subjects, as autists describe. But there is still a degree of difference between this and other modes of existence on the wider spectrum of neurodiversity. Because entrainment reigns as an immediate tendency in neurotypicals, even when they are immersed in a self-entertaining relational field, affordances already agitate, but are not yet objectified. For the neurotypical standing in a grassy farmer's field painting a flower, the flowering of experience may immediately present itself for artistic rendering, as it does for autists. But there will likely also be an equally immediate sense of how the flower stands in relation to grass and trees, including a tacit cartography of how to get from road to field to flower and back, and what that trajectory might afford. This efficacious orienting occurs directly as a field effect on the level of the objectile, not on the level of constituted objects as such.
Ebb and flow. You're late. You're hurrying from the subway to the office on a crowded rush hour sidewalk. Bodies all around, thicker and thinner, faster and slower, in a complex ebb and flow. In the ebb and flow, temporary openings come and go. Your perception is focused on the coming and going of the openings, which correspond to no thing in particular. Each opening is a field effect. It is an artifact of the moving configuration of the bodies around you, factoring in their relative speeds and their rates of acceleration and deceleration as their paths weave around each other and around obstacles. The opening is not simply a hole, a lack of something occupying. It is a positive expression of how everything in the field, moving and still, integrally relates at that instant. It is the appearance of the field's relationality from a particular angle. The particular angle is that of your body getting ahead. The opening is how the field appears as an affordance where you're getting ahead. Your movement has to be present to the opening as it happens. Wait, and the opening closes. Its perception and your moving into it must be one. There's no time to reflect, no time to focus, assess, and choose. If you focus on one body over another, you see one body, then another, and not the opening in the field of movement they share. You have to soften your focus, letting the field's changing configuration dilate to fill experience. You have to let what is normally your peripheral vision take over, attending to everything in, quote, the same way. The experience is then all movement texture, completely patterned, full of change and transition, teemingly differentiated. You're surfing the crowd even as the crowd is surfing you. Despite the rush, this is not without joy. You revel in the fluidity of your trajectory without focusing on it as a feeling tone separate from the movement. You have performed an integral dance of attention, seemingly without thinking.
But you were thinking, with your movement. Your every movement was a performed analysis of the field's composition from the angle of its affordance for getting ahead. Entering the dance of attention, your perceiving converged with your moving activity, and your activity was your thinking. You entered a mode of environmental awareness in which to perceive is to enact thought, and thought is directly relational. This actively relational thinking is also an expression of the field, but in a different mode than storytelling, poetic or not, with no immediate need for language, satisfying itself at a level with the body's movements, integrally embodied expression. In retrospect, it will likely appear to you that the predominant object singled out by your memory, the sidewalk, had been your affordance from the subway to the office. In the office, cluttered with entraining affordances, the computer for emailing, the phone for message checking, the chair for sitting, objects will be in focus again. But in the mode of environmental awareness that effectively got you to the office on time, it was not the object sidewalk that afforded the last leg of your commute. It was the fleeting openings, now forgotten. The openings are long gone. The sidewalk remains. The stability of the sidewalk, its ability to refeature an experience from moment to moment, is an enabling condition for the ephemerality of the openings. This is how what we single out as objects figure for environmental awareness in the moment, as fused into a field of movement, their stability entering into that field on equal footing, as one contrast in its complex relational patterning.
Perhaps the difference between environmental awareness, the environmental awareness of the autist, and that of neurotypicals, is that neurotypicals always fuse the entertainment of the environment with an immediate availing themselves of affordances, whereas the autist becomes the field, integrally co-compositional with it. For the neurotypical, the field comes already saturated with affordances it proposes, with openings or object buds offering themselves as conduits for the field's coming expression, already oriented efficaciously. This efficacious tendency in neurotypicals lends the field more, quote, naturally to the kind of cross-checking that is for fact-finding rather than for story-making in a poetic sense, as it was in Mukhopadhyay's case. For both neurotypicals and autists, and all along the spectrum of neurodiversity, it is only beyond the moment, with memory and with the retellings memory makes possible, that objects will stand out clearly, sagely observing the boundary between experience and imagining. In the moment, they are fused with field effects that are moving and ephemeral and at the threshold.
When the field dances. A mode of existence never pre-exists an event. The sittability of the chair in your office does not preclude the chair becoming an affordance for sleep. The mode of existence has to do with the emergent quality of the experience, not with the factually cross-checked identity of the objects featuring in it. What is startling about the neurotypical is the capacity to background the information of the field and to pre-subtract from the expressive potential of its relational complexity. No cartwheels in the classroom. But what of the classroom? What of our neurotypical children who cannot sit still as they are told how and what to learn? Where is that joy we remember in their perpetually moving and ephemeral 4-year-old bodies before the classroom took over? What presuppositions exist in the very notion of the neurotypical? The, quote, epidemic of, quote, attention deficit disorder rings alarm bells. Might not the diagnosis betray an inattention on the part of adults to an attentiveness of a different order? One mode of existence's deficit may be another's fullness.
Take this example of Mukhopadhyay's. In the context of a classroom much below his intellectual level, he is asked to add 4+2. When he is seemingly incapable of following through with the task, the teacher quickly comes to a conclusion regarding his deficient intellect, assuming that because Mukhopadhyay did not come up with the answer she'd expected, he was incapable of carrying through even the simplest of mathematical equations. Yet listen to how Mukhopadhyay relates the story. Quote, I was wondering why the hell that 4 had to interact with the number 2 through a plus sign. I looked at the number 2, wondering about the coordinate axes of the plane surface and the probable coordinate points the 2 would hold. And as I saw the position of 2 somewhere on the upper side of the page, I mentally assigned it with the coordinate points of 3 and 7. 3 is the x-coordinate and 7 is the y-coordinate. I could see the page divided into graphic grids. I heard my aide saying something like I needed to finish up my work. But I was busy assigning a coordinate value to 4. Finally, I settled with the values of 3 and 9 as x and y coordinates. I gave a quick value to the addition sign also. Then I found a whole story of number characters other than merely 2 and 4 competing, quarreling, and asserting themselves to be written down. Finally, I needed the help of average. I took the average on the x side and the average on the y side to bring peace among the numbers, end quote.
Mukhopadhyay is in the thick of a number field of experience. Just as color, shadow, and smell were in active interplay in the sunlit field, numbers are in a commotion of relational activity, each vying to be written down, to be the conduit of the field's summing up in a determinate expression. The lack of the expected outcome, that 4+2 equals 6, clearly has less to do with Mukhopadhyay's capacity for reasoning than with the deficiency in entrainment. This is a, quote, deficiency only in the sense that the summing up of the field, the subtraction from the fullness of its complexity of a particular product that stands out from it, takes more time because the immediate field of experience does not come already oriented for efficacy. The neurotypical approach is to jump as quickly as possible to the most, quote, reasonable outcome, the one most easily cross-checkable factually. That this, quote, rationality is a subtraction from the fielding of an event much richer than it is rarely acknowledged. The event is too rarely perceived in the more of the less of its sum, in the intensity of its emergent multiplicity. For Mukhopadhyay, mathematics dances to attention in a way that lends it to the relational force of its associated milieu. All manner of exotic potential outcomes vie. Quote, Mukhopadhyay, what if a two-dimensional point is added to a four-dimensional point? I saw the fourth time vector coordinate leading the plane in a clockwise motion, coming back every 12 hours in a 360-degree rotation. My day filled with the exotic wonders that 2 plus 4 could offer. I developed a very powerful 2 plus 4 system, which kept my mind and senses entertained for the rest of the day. End quote. The equation, it turns out, is much more than 2 numbers, a plus sign, and an outcome. It is the generating of a field that modulates experience, that entertains, that busies the body and absorbs attention, that creates a panoply of sense. Mathematics is intrinsically related to the experience of the day's unfolding, to how the world gyrates with potential, to how time itself works. It is not a discrete tool or task. It is a procedure integrally entering into, quote, the self-enjoyment, to use a term from Whitehead, of the environmental field. The gateway called moment.
Just as language comes late, speedy equation solving also comes late. The event, intensified by the field effects of relational potential, entrains as an afterthought. This leaves the commotional complexity of the moment in gyration. Quote, moments could get out of control, Mukhopadhyay writes, when they become unpredictable and too large for my senses to accumulate all that they involve within their field. One moment you may look at a picture and at the same time you are aware of the pink wall around the picture. You're also aware of Jacques' voice explaining something about the picture. The very next moment you're looking at the reflection through its glass frame, which is competing for attention while you're looking at the picture. You may see a part of the room reflected in the glass, and you may also be absorbed in the reflection that you may not hear, be so absorbed in the reflection that you may not hear anything from Jacques' voice, because you suddenly discover that those reflections are conspiring to tell you a story. Jacques' voice may float in that story as big or small bubbles, end quote. Voice and reflections in a struggle to define the predominant experiential register of the event. Voice vying the background reflection, reflection endeavoring to encompass voice as a bubbling parcel of itself. This is the experience of a conversation for Mukhopadhyay. Immersion in the activity of the field, alive with competing tendencies to sort itself out. The focus is less on what might typically be assumed to be the content of the conversation than on its dynamic form, the performative tendencies enacting the event of itself relating. The playing out of the tendencies is what sorts out the field. Quote, moments are defined by what your senses are compelled to attend to, Mukhopadhyay continues. A moment may include a shadow of Jacques' chair falling on the floor, or a pen peeping out from the pile of papers, perhaps wishing to have a voice, so that it could say aloud, here I am, end quote. The cry of expression already sounds in the field. The field is already expressing a tendency towards something, singling out. Even now, in the immediacy of the moment, something is already calling out for the right to stand out. Efficaciously or poetically, it is not yet clear.
Note that in Mukhopadhyay's recounting, the moment is the subject. The subject of the experience is not the human, but the fielding of the event itself. The human element alone is not sufficient to account for the field's activity. Instead of a precomposed subject standing over and above the event, overshadowing the moment, we have a vying commotion of coactivity. The dynamic form of that coactivity coming toward expression is what Whitehead calls the subjective form of the event. In Mukhopadhyay's account, the moment's subjective form is as yet unresolved. It quivers still in the disquiet of the intensely resonant field. The problem of the moment is how the commotion will sort out. Which register of field effect will stand out, having most forcefully expressed itself vis-à-vis the others? Only once this shakedown occurs will the determinate content of the event be defined as predominantly a reflecting or a conversing, a shadowing or a penning. This brings to mind William James' work on the pen in relation to consciousness. He writes,
quote, "This pen is, in the first instance, a bald that. To get classified either as a physical pen or as someone's percept of a pen, it must assume a function. And that can only happen in a more complicated world. So far as in that world it is a stable feature, holds ink, marks paper, and obeys the guidance of the hand, it is a physical pen. So far as it is unstable, coming and going with the movement of my eyes, altering with what I call my fancy, continuous with subsequent experiences of its having been, in the past tense, it is the percept of a pen in my mind. Those peculiarities are what we mean by being conscious in a pen."
In a pen? Here I am, screams Mukapadai's pen. I am in the moment, put the moment in me, pen the moment.
In James, the moment is the gateway to a conscious experience of a determinate kind, a pen experience in a world complicated by function, a world of definite use value. One of the reasons this level of worlding is complicated, as opposed to complex, is that the pen double features in it. It alternates between two roles. Grasp it from the angle of entrainment, from the angle of what it can do, hold ink, mark paper, obey the guidance of the hand, and it emerges as a stable physical object as opposed to being a percept. Humor it in the ephemerality of its self-entertainment, in the way it comes and goes, self-relating, continuous with subsequent experiences of its having been, and the pen emerges as a percept. What we call the cognitive relation is in fact a pattern of the pen emerging alternately as physical or as percept across different moments. The pen can only do this double cognitive duty because, quote, in the first instance, in the singularity of each and every moment's come and go, it was an indeterminate field effect, a bald that, not yet this or that. In this uncertainty of fielding, consciousness is already dawning, but has not yet blossomed into a fully formed cognition. The pen, as Whitehead would say, is already cognizable, but not yet finally cognized. It is as yet but a cognizable factor in field experience. When the moment has penned itself into a determinate emergence, consciousness begins to flicker. It is holding pen and its use value distinctly in the foreground in a now object-centered entertainment. Now entertainment is of the object pen, not of the full field. The field is no longer saturated with entrainment, but is heavy with it locally. The singled-out object pen bears all the weight of it. Field-wide entertainment, its integral relationality, has been backgrounded. But the background only stands out because the foreground only stands out because it has a background to stand out from. Background and foreground are in mutual embrace. The backgrounded activity, still vying for attention. Consciousness flickers with the tension between backgrounded environmental awareness and foregrounded cognition. Cognition is the impossibility of grasping the field in all of its cognizable effects. This is what it means to be conscious in a pen as opposed to be cognizant of it. It means to be cognizant in a commotional, becoming pen field.
The difference in Mukapadai's case is that the pen's call, here I am, remains interwoven with Jacques' laughter rather than distinctly taking to the fore. Quote, and within the same moment, Mukapadai continues, there may be a sudden sound of laughter that can dissolve the stories told by the reflections and the sullen silence of the chair's shadow with its demanding noise, making you wonder which part of the funny story from Jacques' voice you missed, listening to while you were watching the giant blades of the fan pushing out every story and sound away from it with air, end quote. Instead of immediately tuning to what Whitehead calls cognition's, quote, small focal region of clear illumination, the event here gives equal billing to the field of the cognizable, what for the fully formed cognition will remain a, quote, large penumbral region of experience which tells of intense experience in dim apprehension, end quote, flickeringly reminding us that, quote, the simplicity of clear consciousness is no measure of the complexity of complete experience, Whitehead. In the moment, in the pen might just as well have been in the blades or in the laughter. It all depends on how the commotion cognitively shakes down in the end. Even at the cognitive end of the experience, the large penumbral region of experience still flickers with what might just as well have been. It is the remaining refuge of experience's variety.
Variations. Experience's variety does not preclude the efficacy of use. It includes it differently. Take Mukhopadhyay's experience of the door. He writes, quote, "The color comes, and then the shape, and then the size. The whole thing needs time to get integrated. To be described as a door, there's position, the opener closed," end quote. When Mukhopadhyay sees the door, he does not immediately see a threshold for passage, as a neurotypical person might. He sees qualities and a texture of integral experience. Color fields first, and from that interplay, shape asserts itself. Here I am. Then with shape comes size. This relay of emergence is now ready to be described as a door. Only now does it have position, only now does it afford passage. As it becomes determinate, an object form separates out from the dynamic form, an affordance opens, and the tendency for describing makes itself felt, tuning to language. The field has pressed on toward expressing itself in language. The field of emergence is ready to tell its story. Mukhopadhyay does see the door, and its doorness does allow it to function for crossing through, and its affordance is expressible in language. But it all takes time. It takes time for the field of experience to actively sort itself out toward its coming to determinate expression.
To a neurotypical, something qualitatively different tends to occur in the same field. Because going through a door is such a habitual experience, the crossing is likely to occur as if automatically, without the interplay of qualities, the relay, the emergence of a door, and the opening of affordance even registering. Doorness disappears. The door figures as always already passed through. Any description of it will have to be a reconstitution, the event coming toward expression in language from the field of memory rather than the field of immediacy. This is yet another variation, in addition to environmental awareness and cognition and their flicker, that of reflective consciousness. Reflective consciousness is a variation on the neurotypical, underlining the point made earlier that every mode of existence, including the neurotypical, is in fact neurodiverse, intermodal in its internal composition.
Quote, "What happens if the position changes, if, say, we close the door?" Portia Iverson asks Mukhopadhyay, quote, "It may disrupt the whole thing, and you may need to start once again," he responds. The emergence toward objecthood, affordance, and linguistic expression has to return to the field and start again from the bald that of the moment. The key difference between the autist and the neurotypical is that the neurotypical does not explicitly need to start over at every moment. The neurotypical has always at the ready a kind of experiential shorthand with which to abridge the event, habit. The neurotypical has at the ready a procedure for reconstituting something from the phases of experience's fielding whose immediate entertainment was skipped, the procedure of reflective consciousness. The shortening of experience by habit and its reconstitution by reflection go neurotypically hand in hand with the greatest of fluidity. What falls out between habit and reflection, leaving a gap they work in concert to smooth over with the aid of language coming from the field of memory, is the coming alive of the field of experiential immediacy and in its emergent dance of attention. Chunking.
Anne Corwin, self-described engineer, science geek, cat appreciator, hyperlexic infovore, and maker of various and random quasi-functional objects, explains how entering a room is different for an autist. Quote, "I would probably walk into the room and see check patterns before even being able to identify the door as a door and the tablecloth as a tablecloth. The process of resolving patterns and shapes and forms into familiar objects is actually a semi-conscious one for me. I often tend to sit on floors and other surfaces even if furniture is available, because it's a lot easier to identify flat surface a person can sit on than it is to sort the environment into chunks like couch, chair, floor, and coffee table. There is much more. There is always much more."
It is no doubt easier to habitually cross into a room that itself habitually chunks into chairs and tables, than to begin with the whole field pattern as yet unresolved into shapes. Rather than chunking, what occurs on the autistic spectrum of neurodiversity is an immediate entertainment of modalities of relation, pattern, and interplay of contrasts comes before familiar use and describable chunking.
The neurotypical approach backgrounds this modulation of relational emphases by subtracting from the emergent environment that which is not immediately suited to its use. In the case of a dinner party, upon entering a foreign dining room, the neurotypical will likely align to the entrainments of chair sittability and table eatability before they even fully note the checkedness of the field. In another context, painting the kitchen, for instance, the causal efficacy or the entrainment of chairness will shift automatically to laddering, upsetting any notion of entrainment, that entrainment is unvarying. What is unvarying about entrainment is that it is always emphasis by subtraction. In yet another context, say creating an art installation in the kitchen, the affordances of entertainment get backgrounded. Of entrainment get backgrounded. Entertainment takes over, now with a richly textured relational emphasis co-involving field effects of color, light, and surface, pattern, and contrast, the whole characterized by an overall field quality of airiness or crampiness, convivial freshness, or the staleness of familial constriction. The field of immediacy reappears for itself in its own qualitative relational terms. It will sort out one way or another, but in the moment there always will have been much more.
The much more, always more, of Corwin's entering a room suggests that the challenge for autism lies with the less of subtraction. The room is immediately experienced in its always more, each chunking in achievement, a new adventure and experience coming alive toward expression.
I taught myself to read at 3, Amanda Baggs relates, and I had to learn it again at 10, and yet again at 17, and at 21, and at 26. The words that it took me 12 years to find have been lost again and regained and lost, and still have not come all the way back to where I can reasonably be confident that they'll be there when I need them. It wasn't enough to figure out just once how to keep track of my eyes and ears and hands and feet all at the same time. I've lost track of them and had to find them over and over again.
Against neuro-reductionism. The neuro is everywhere in the air today. Neuroarchitecture, neuroaesthetics, neurocriticism. We have advanced the term neurodiversity here in order to problematize the neuro no less than the typical. Certain of today's neurocurrents, those informed by embodied cognition and its younger offspring, enactive perception, converge in some respects with the account developed here. We are uneasy, however, with the general excitement generated by recent advances in brain imaging technology, which have been met with another wave of the cyclic craze for finding neural correlates of experiential events. The models, admittedly, are vastly more complex than earlier paradigms of localization, nuanced as they are with notions of systemic feedback, distributed networks, and emergent patterning of neural activity. In spite of these very real advances, the problem remains for us that the impulse to identify an experiential event with a brain state tends to take precedence and is too often given the first and last word. This cerebral reductionism runs counter to the other tendencies equally present in today's neurocurrents. Beginning and ending the conversation with brain states sidelines problematics of a kind that might be considered phenomenological were the field of immediate experience. Considered phenomenological, where the field of immediate experience is always already subjective or even pre-subjective in the sense of already imbued with specifically human meaning, just waiting to be disclosed or translatable from the status of an implicit knowledge into an explicit schema. For us, as for autists, this isn't the case. We approach the field of experience as, quote, pure, in William James's sense of being neither subjective nor objective yet ready to be both or either, more and less, multiplicitously. Whatever human meaning and experience has, whatever schema it exhibits, it has achieved them as an adventure of integrally renewed self-composition and emergent variation, starting always all over again from that bald, commotional bat of the gateway that is moment. This forbids appealing to phenomenology as a corrective to our discomfort with neuro-reductionism. From the perspective developed here, the notion of neural correlates, the idea that experiential events correspond to brain states, errs in presupposing the dichotomy between the determinately physical and the fically perceptual. In our account, following James and Whitehead, this distinction takes form on the highly derived level of reflective consciousness, which is itself predicated on the subtractive emergence of cognition from a richer and more encompassing field of coming experience. The search for neural correlates glosses over the immediacy of the field of experience, its phased becomings and variations, its flickerings, its constant reminders that the simplicity of clear consciousness is no measure for the complexity of complete experience. The search for neural correlates glosses over this intensity and complexity in theory, while in practice, it constantly returns to it without acknowledging that move.
The surreptitious appeal by neuroscientists to the total field is a practical necessity, because a correlation between an experiential event and a brain state cannot be established without eliciting an experiential event from which a brain image can be extracted. Subjects are shown particular images, or inducted into certain kinds of activity, or induced into certain affective orientations. A mapping of brain activity is then extracted from the event by the imaging technology. The predominant experiential characteristics of the context from which the image has been extracted, a visual perception of a certain type, the execution of a particular category of act, an affective priming of a certain cast, is then set against the brain state. The brain state is construed as the physical, objective, bodily side of the event, and the predetermined experiential characteristics of the context are construed as the perceptual, subjective, phenomenal side. Nonetheless, however the correlation is construed philosophically, it tends to be lopsided. The physical side tends to be treated as explanatory of the perceptual side. This reduces the perceptual subjective phenomenal to the status of an epiphenomenon. Even interpretations which tie the two sides together with a model of emergence cannot escape the explanatory lopsiding inherent in attributing epiphenomenal status to the phenomenal. The physical objective bodily comes out more, quote, real. Inherent to every, quote, discovery of a correlation, there is a valorization of the determinately physical pole, since the entire setup is designed precisely in order to extract this side of the event. The technology used is custom-made precisely for that. The whole exercise is angled toward the emphasis by subtraction of the physical from the experimental context.
To put it another way, the laboratory setup always re-enters its project of explanatory modeling through the gateway called moment. An event is triggered. However controlled the context, there are always minor elements considered peripheral to the predominant type, category, or cast of the context to which the brain state will be correlated. The contribution of these active ingredients to the total field falls out. It is pre-designed out of the model. This is no small thing because among the minor so-called ingredients are a whole panoply of relational field effects, which from the point of view of the environmental awareness we've been talking about are absolutely integral to the genesis of the event. The experimental setup systematically subtracts them in order to emphasize the contribution of the brain to the extent that it can be reduced to the physical. We're not saying that this has no value. It has undeniable therapeutic value to the extent that the neural factors set enabling conditions for the playing out of the event. Our point is that the activity of neurons enter the event on an equal footing with other ingredients to it, from the angle of their ability to co-compose relational field effects. Alone, they are nothing. Together with other ingredients, which are of every conceivable, determinable nature, the neurons vie to have their voice heard most loudly in the way in which the event moves toward expression. Take me, take me. The neuroscientist takes them happily, without realizing that when the neuronal as such is most determining of the outcome of the event is when the event is operating at its most automatic. The so-called physical is in fact a limit state of the habitual. It's extreme. Much goes into making a habit besides electrical impulses and chemical signals. A whole world of relationality enters into it, subtractively. The physical as automatic habitual is a subtractive limitation of the dance of attention of the field of experience. Extracting it from the field is adding subtraction to subtraction, carrying the emphasis by subtraction of habit to a higher power. This is exactly what makes neurocentric modeling so useful therapeutically. It isolates the subtractive limit of the field of experiences functioning. At the limit of that limit lies the pathological. when the automaticity of the physical takes over to the point of undermining the use value of habit on other levels of the relational world. The whole setup is contrived as a function of the pathological. That is our point. The neuro is inherently a therapeutic concept contrived with and for the pathological, which is to say that it is guided by an a priori commitment to a presupposed, quantifiable, base state distinction between the normal and the pathological. No matter what kind of philosophical calisthenics are performed around it, the neuro remains profoundly neurotypical.
There is no doubt that autists' brains are wired differently. There is the possibility that this difference may be cured. Our point is that while the neuro has therapeutic value, it only has explanatory value in a context that it explicitly works with and through the nuances of the experiential in its shifting expressions. In the moment, the immediate field of experience is self-explaining in the way it complexly plays out, composing a self-expressive outcome for itself. From moment to moment, experience explains itself more extensively in the variations on its expressive outcomes. Its self-explaining always starts from qualitative field effects, like colored shadow. Its outcomes always have an overall qualitative color or affective tonality. The field of experience is best described as relational qualitative, not physical or perceptual, or some correlated combination of these. The question of, quote, curing modes of existence, like autism, must be situated on this relational qualitative ground. It is not just a therapeutic question. It is a question of the diversity of modes of existence, and of the modes of thought they enact, and of the varieties of expressive outcomes they compose, and of the differing determinations of experience those outcomes instantiate in the world. The question of curing is in fact an ecological question concerning how diversities co-inhabit the same field of becoming human and co-compose. D.J. Savary's, writing in the crushingly over-medicalized United States, polemically makes this point in terms of freedom, playing the conventional political rhetoric of his country of birth against its tendency toward therapeutic overkill. Quote, "The great United States of America is breathtakingly not free. Equality is not as sacred because not everyone has access to it.
Freedom is not as available as many people think.
First, free people treat my people, very smart people who type to communicate, as mindless.
Second, they underestimate us very badly instead of reaching out to us.
The creators of everyone's very important Declaration of Independence wasted their breath." End quote.
What we have endeavored to help draft, co-composing with writers like D.J. Savary, Amanda Baggs, and Tito Mukhopadhyay, is a Declaration of Independence from neuro-reductionism.
Yeah, thank you very much, first of all. Are there questions or remarks? Sorry.
Hi. Thank you both for your lecture. Erin, earlier I was talking to you about your work with mobile architectures and the relationship between mobile architectures and structured improvisation, and how that reminded me of the work of Deborah Hay. Now hearing you talk about your work with autists and the way that autists exist in a field of openings and having a sensitivity to their environments, again puts me in mind of Deborah Hay and her speaking about the presence of improvising dancers. One of the things that she talks about, one of the things that she says first in her workshops is, what if where I am is what I need, which is one of my favorite things to think about as an improviser. So anyway, thinking about the linkages of these two lines of research for you leads me to my question for you, which is, what, if any, are the relationships between your lines of research in autism and in mobile architectures? And are mobile architectures only a product of or in the realm of the neurotypical?
So, I just finished writing 300 pages on that, so I'm not sure I can do it in a few sentences, but I'll do my best. Just for those who don't know the work, what I'm suggesting with mobile architecture is similar to what Deleuze was suggesting with a diagram in relation to Bacon's work, that there is a kind of capacity for dance to create the more than of the singular bodies on the stage, that it can take off into a kind of field experience. That you're left with as really an experience of the field and no longer of the dancers themselves. And that when this occurs, something qualitatively different begins to come to expression. And I'm interested in this qualitative change. And so you're absolutely right that for me, the work is absolutely interlinked. And in the book that I'm writing, what I've been trying to do is to have this work, this autistic work, really running parallel to the dance work, and not suggesting that they're the same thing, but rather that there is something that I can learn from the narratives of these autistic people and my interactions with them, the work I've done with them, in terms of the modality of field perception, of environmental awareness, and what I experience in the field of dance, in this particular context, as what I call the more than human of dance. So I'm increasingly interested in how movement courses through bodies, dancers' bodies, for instance, but doesn't begin and end with them. And that if a dance event, and this could also be an installation that involves movement, if a dance event works, it has created something that has the quality of perception that we're talking about here. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just maybe in relation to notions of improvised, of structured improvisation, our ending on the word freedom shouldn't be taken to imply that we're just talking about going back to some kind of completely unrestricted, unconstrained field of play. But when we talk about field effects, we're talking about things that are constrained by what we call enabling constraints. But the enabling constraints aren't linear causes, but they're that without which an effect of a certain kind could not come, but the effect is not on the same level of them. For example, if you have two colors that mutually modulate each other in the same field of vision, the overall effect is neither one color nor the other, and you can't decompose their contributions to that field effect. And in a field including color and other aspects of experience, there's whole panoplies of contrasts that can be triggered into a unified field effect in a certain register. So for us, improvising is a way of maybe rethinking or removing, making them move differently into unified field effects that might be less habitual and maybe are even newly created in that moment. So we're more interested in the concepts of indirect causation, sort of complex field causation and effect, but it's really the effective level that matters most. Both.
I hope this continues along that line of that last question, and just in terms of the translation between the kind of the therapeutic realm and the curatorial realm, since they would both deal with questions of cure and care, and then the double problem of both harming that something by bringing it into existence. And I wondered if maybe there's more tension between the typical and the normative. Since it would seem that there could be typicalities that have to do with certain kinds of distributions, and there could be diversities like Gardner's multiple intelligences that don't necessarily yield a kind of engaged difference, right? So if that problematic that one would ascribe to this therapeutic complex is also that of art making, I wonder if that would implicate us in that tension between the typical and the normative in a different way.
Yeah, I think There's a concept in Foucault's later thinking where he makes a distinction between two modes of normativity. One more associated with what he calls disciplinary power, where there's a pre-existent model of the type that is then imposed or bodies brought to embody. And the other is one that I think he calls it normation, where from gathering up typical occurrences, a norm is always re-emerging. So in a sense, there's a kind of aesthesis of the type on the basis of a distribution of diversity in the field. And that sort of complicates the whole relationship between power and the aesthetic. I think obviously we're tending more toward the side of effects that emerge from a field of diversity, but what we're suggesting is that what emerges doesn't have to be in any definition a norm, but it can be what we might call, following Simondon or Whitehead, an existential value, an affective, experiential, immediate value, so that we would try to displace the question toward a relation between norm and value rather than between normativity and typicality.
Yeah, just to add to that, hopefully it was clear that this is a real political project for us, but also for the activists involved in the neurodiversity movement. And this is a project that has emerged, there's been autism forever, obviously, but it has emerged very strongly since the internet, because the internet allows for the time. We've talked a lot about how long it takes, the actual amount of time it takes to go from entertainment to entrainment in autistic perception. And so this turn, societal turn, toward a capacity to be in conversation with modes of perception that are part of how we live, part of our own experience, and certainly, especially part probably of those who have an artistic engagement, but also not wanting to collapse the two into each other too quickly, because these people that I work with are obviously autistic, and so they're discriminated against under all conditions. I mean, just getting into a classroom takes an enormous amount of capital and time and so on, and so it's a sort of a tug and war between that. And I just want to say one thing that we didn't have time to mention, which is sort of something to think about, which is that all of the autists, I think without exception, all of the autists who have come to language through the method that is called facilitated communication, so it has to do with a sort of a relational form of writing. They don't have the motor capacities to hold their own body, to even find their own body, and so they develop modes, sometimes a touch on the elbow to remind where the arm is, for example, or a touch or holding a pencil or whatever. All of these autists come to language in poetry. They can learn to write prose, but they actually come writing poetry. And so they have something to teach us, I think, about the pathway that has become more typical in a neurotypical classroom, which is to begin with prose, to begin with a sort of larger macro organization of knowledge, and then to go from there to art, rather than the other way around.
I also just wanted to mention that when Erin was talking, she was referring to the fact that autism is more and more starting to be thought of as a motor dysfunction rather than as a cognitive dysfunction, and it's very difficult to overcome that typecasting. But I think it's important to try to replace the discussion on the level of action, on the level of activity and co-activity, rather than jumping straight to the cognitive level, because a difference in activation is not necessarily a cognitive deficit, but it could very much be a cognitive variety, a species.
So, thank you both for that very stimulating presentation, but I also particularly enjoyed your interactions as well, which gave us a lovely liveliness. Particularly the bit that suddenly started working for me was when you were talking about ebb and flow. And I can see the connections that a previous question has made with dance improvisation, but I actually started connecting it with the extract from the Ziga Vertov movie, and thinking that perhaps in some ways that seeing of openings in what would seem a chaotic stream that Ziga Vertov is presenting is also connected with the modern city, with the problem of modernity. But the problematic that Professor Rozier raised, or at least emerged, was one of the question of relationalities, and relationalities almost in a political sense, and the problem about within the modern, and perhaps the downside of the kind of tendency towards totalitarianism that the communist system became. I just wondered what your notion of the sort of neurodiversity, how that might help us reimagine a relationality that might have a political usefulness. Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, this work on autism got started because of an extraordinary video by Amanda Baggs called In My Language that you can find on YouTube. I really suggest you do it. And when I saw the Vertov film, again, after many, many years, or the quote of it, I immediately whispered to Brian, that's just like Amanda Baggs' video. There's something to be thought here for sure, and although I don't have any definite answers, you know, this is the project really for me is exactly where you're situating it. It seems to me that we are at a place ecologically speaking in the large notion of the ecology going beyond the environment to modes of relation, modes of existence, etc., where it seems really important to me that we challenge the idea that the human is at the center of experience. And so, as we mentioned in the beginning of this, the whole idea that autists are unrelational, which probably most of you thought, because that's worked so well in the lore about autism, has to do with the fact that when they go to the doctor's offices, they don't necessarily look at or engage with the doctor. There are incredible shadows on the walls. There are incredible lights. There may be interesting patterns on the floor, which are just as interesting and often more interesting than the human to them. And somehow they're amazingly wired to not feel the human is predominant in the environment. And so it strikes me that would be a place from whence to think the political, right? So really to think seriously about the forms of experience and the modes of existence that are activated by a practice of engagement in the world, with the world, that isn't first and foremost a grafting of an object or a grafting of the human from experience or into experience.
So I think the overall perspective, as Erin was explaining, is toward an ecological politics, more in a Guattarian sense than in the narrow environmentalist sense. For me personally, I think I need to think that less in terms of historical periods or cultural periods than in terms of phases of capital. Again, in Foucault's later work, when he's writing about human capital, he has this short passage where he says that governmentality is perhaps being superseded by something that he calls environmentality. And he ties that to the complexity of a field in which events that are each atypical as they're happening come together, and some kind of multiplier effect has to be captured from that, so the individual is no longer the separate sort of morally instructed individual of 19th century capitalism in the earlier phases, but is this kind of affective resonator to capture those field effects. And he develops that analysis through an analysis of pain and the problem with the economic theory of human capital, which is there can be affective field effects at a distance that can't be put into the equations or thought of in advance, such as someone reacting to someone's pain far away on the other side of the world, not in a self-concerned way, but in a way that might lead them to actions that are not economically rational and cannot be predicted. So he's saying that just as he's creating this vision of of the individual as human capital, he's showing how it is undermined by affective effects that belong to a kind of field experience that has everything to do with the stage of capitalism that we've now entered. So I would try to bring it much more into toward theories of capital than toward theories of modernity or postmodernity, etc.
One last question.
Hey, I think my question has more to do with the first one. There was one funny moment in the talk where there was the slip between artist and artists. And I mean, also in the discussion where I got the impression that you somehow presented the artist as the privileged aesthetic subject in a certain sense. The artist, the artist. The artist would not be so interesting. So the artist as the privileged aesthetic subject, and you linked this to, if I could just put it that way, to a certain praise of indeterminacy. Now, I would agree that the aesthetic, of course, has to do a lot with making things indeterminate. And that a lot of contemporary artistic practice, what one could put under the title of the open work of art, right, has to do with this, questioning of what the actual aesthetic object is, right, and opening this field. But now my worry comes in when indeterminacy is left as such. And I think that somehow is misleading in terms of making the artist the privileged aesthetic subject, because I think aesthetic experience actually has a lot to do with this play or this tense relationship between determination and indeterminacy.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was trying to get at with this idea of enabling constraints, and the idea is very much not simple indeterminacy, because we're describing the field of experience as full of tendencies vying to come to expression, and the relationality of their vying is co-determining of the outcome. So it's a theory of co-determination, and indeterminacy is always a moment returned to in a moment that subtends the determination, but it's not just indeterminacy, it's what Peirce calls a determination to be determined, a vagueness that is a determination to be determined. So that it's all we're writing about is the movement toward determination as an aesthesis, as a process of experience. And what we're saying is that there are different aesthetic products, and that functions, typicalities, objects are aesthetic products, but there are other kinds that preserve the movement and the tendential tenor of the field and its complexity more than those do, because those are designed to be capturable into other kinds of circuits.
Yeah, obviously we're pulling a lot from Whitehead here, and it's probably hard to get in an hour-long read version, but there are two really key concepts here that come out of Whitehead, which we've renamed, and they are causal efficacy and presentational immediacy. And just because this is really important to what we're saying, what Whitehead would say is that in fact, once an occasion exists, and he's talking about a half second, and really we're always talking about a half second here. We're not talking about an event in terms of a span of time that is quite long. Once an occasion exists, it cannot mutate. And so Whitehead asks, so it's completely monadic. He asks, well, what is it, though, that is constantly changing? I mean, his major work is called Process and Reality. Obviously, it's going to be about process for him. And so the question will be, what occurs in the cusps, on the edges of this determination? So determination is what we know will happen. The act will be what it is. And the question is, what are the conditions for it being what it is? Coming back, for example, to the question of structured improvisation, I've said elsewhere, and I think we both have, that improvisation doesn't ever come out of a chaos. The chaos is uninteresting. The everything goes is not where we situate ourselves at all. It's actually comes out of an enormous amount of technique. an enormous amount of structuring, in fact. And out of this structuring, something can emerge. This something that can emerge carries the germ of all of that technique, of all of the pastness, of all of the events that went into it. And what is the novelty in it is not its molar attribute, but the quality that it brings to this particular set of merging or coming events. So really the point that we're making here is that there is a strange elasticity of time in autistic expression, which allows us to emphasize, to dwell somewhere that we don't usually dwell. Although certainly those of us who teach art or dance or whatever spend a lot of time dwelling there. That's what we try to teach, right? And what I think we're wanting to do is to say that we can learn in that dwelling place. If the autists we were working with were here today, they would say that they work really hard to get to the place where the object emerges. Because in the world that we live in, if you can't find the object, you're in real, you're not going to get on the bus, or you're not going to manage being where you need to be. So it's not a question of indetermination versus determination, but rather of the kinds of modes of elasticity that occur between those different points of perhaps experience.
Yeah, thank you again very, very much. Just a very short remark from my side. I got the feeling that there might be similarity, but also, of course, differences as well. Between Jacques Paussier's concern in regard to his static regime and a certain notion also, for example, beauty in Kant, and what you're dealing with from a post-Kantian perspective. And if I remember right, even Whitehead says something on that. Yeah. Thank you very much. Now we are over.